like that. I always get the munchies late at night, and I always go into my pantry and hope to find something delicious in there. And of course, whenever I see a bag of chips and I open it up and I eat the first chip, I go, ooh, man, these stale chips are so good. Never, right? That stale chips are absolutely one of the worst things in life, maybe. And also, as we know, that relationships can also go very stale. And also, as we looked at last week, that this worship, Sundays, our Sabbath, can become very, very, very stale. And none of us love stale things. But interestingly, it seems like many of us tolerate stale Sundays or stale Sabbath way more than we would tolerate stale chips, because the moment you have stale chips, you throw them away in the garbage. And oftentimes, even stale relationships, oftentimes we either work really hard to fix it, or we say, you know what, this is no longer tenable and I can't deal with it anymore, and then so we let that go, right? And the question that we asked last week is, why do things go stale? Why do chips and relationships, and particularly why do our Sundays go stale? And I said there's two primary reasons why things go stale. One, sometimes you just get a really bad batch of chips. Sometimes the ingredients with which it's supposed to be made is just bad from the get-go. The chips are no good, the potatoes are no good, the frying was no good, whatever. And so it's just going to be bad from the get-go. Relationships sometimes just are structured in a way where the two people aren't ready, or friendships aren't ready, or people aren't mature enough, whatever, that it's just bad from the get-go, and therefore it doesn't work, right? And with worship, I was suggesting last week that if we come into this place, which I suggest we all do, with a bent overness like the woman of 18 years being held by a spirit, that if we are not released from this bent overness, whatever that might be for you, that Sundays and Sabbath will indeed be stale, because you cannot authentically worship if you're being bound by something that's keeping you bent over. And then I asked you last week, what is it for you? And are you asking Jesus to release you, right? Are you taking the steps as the woman did to come from the back to the front and allowing Jesus to say, woman, you are released from this, right? Now, the second reason why I think things go stale is because you forget, or you neglect, or you abuse the original intended purpose, right? So for instance, chips or cookies or whatever are meant to be eaten in one sitting. And to demonstrate this for you, actually I was having a conversation with Chung this past week at the Woodlands graduation, and he told me that he and Joseph got into a little bit of a fight this week for something kind of interesting. And I asked him, so why? And he's like, well, so, well, we have these chips in our house, and they have 4 siblings, and they're like, well, sometimes you get the regular chips, which are like, not crunchy, but, they're like the regular chips, and then you get the chewy kind, right? There's 2 different kinds, right? And so they had the 2 kinds of chips, brand new bags open, and Joseph wanted to eat the non-chewy kind, and Sungtaek wanted to eat the chewy kind. And they couldn't decide which one to open, and so they fought over it, and then eventually they couldn't decide, and from my understanding, Sungtaek said, forget it, I'm done, and he left, and then when he left, Joseph opened the, of course, non-chewy bag, and then he ate the non-chewy bag. So then I asked him, why didn't you just open up both? Eat what you wanted, and then close it up. And here was Sungtaek's answer. Again, we weren't talking about anything, we were just at the graduation. I don't know why this topic came up. We were talking about something about Sungtaek and Che or whatever. But anyways, I asked him, why can't you just open both up and then seal them? Like, they even come with like the little sticky things that you can like seal, and it's supposed to keep it fresh. And then Sungtaek goes, because once you open it, it's no longer as fresh as before you opened it. So if you don't eat it all in one sitting, it's ruined. So we couldn't open up both because we're not going to eat both bags or both containers of cookies. And so we had to decide which one, and we couldn't decide which one because I wanted one and Joseph wanted the other. And so no, you can't open both bags, Pastor, because it's not as fresh, right? If you leave and neglect things over time, they go bad. Same thing with relationships. If you leave and or neglect or forget the purpose of a relationship, which is to outlove, outserve, outcommunion one another so that the other one is thriving to the best of their ability, that relationship will most likely go stale when you make it about you and turn it into an inward selfish type of a thing. And so when it comes to worship, then the thing we got to ask is, well, what is Sabbath worship for? What's the purpose of this place? And that's what we're going to look at today, and we'll answer that question, right? Because although stale chips or stale cookies, once they go stale, you go, see ya, and you chuck it in the garbage. And again, as I said, relationships, you might maybe say, you know what, I'm done, and you might forget it, and then you might want to leave it. I suggest stale Sabbath, of the 3 we're talking about, is the one thing that I know for a fact can be revived, regenerated, redeemed, and even better, redeemed way better than it was ever before. It is the nature of Sabbath worship for us, and so the thing we want to look at is why and how can we do so? And of course, last week I said the one way that we recover this stale Sabbath that maybe we've created for ourselves is that you are released to worship. That you need to be released from the things that are holding you down, bending you over, so that you can indeed worship just as the woman did. The moment she was released from it, she got up and she worshiped. And the text seems to suggest that she worshiped like she never worshiped before for 18 long years. And so one, we must be set free to worship. But then the second thing that I think this passage teaches about recovering stale Sabbath is that we must see the Sabbath as Jesus sees the Sabbath. A lot of S's, I know, but it's one way for you to remember it. That we must see the Sabbath as Jesus sees the Sabbath. So we're going to do a couple things today as we go through. One, we're going to just reset the scene and kind of examine the argument between Jesus and the ruler to kind of get an understanding of what this thing is. And then second, we're going to look at how does the ruler, right, the one who complains, how does he see the Sabbath? And then we're going to look at how does Jesus see the Sabbath, and then figure out, okay, what are we supposed to learn so that we can make our stale Sabbath go and become what they were meant to be, okay? So let's reset the scene, okay? So as you know, Jesus is teaching on the Sabbath. It's kind of like me maybe teaching here at the church, at their synagogue, at the church on a Sunday. He sees a bent-over woman, and then he says, hey, woman, come over here. And then she walks over, bent over like this. And then before she gets to him, he goes, woman, you are freed from your sickness, or you're freed from your bondage, right? And immediately, right? And as he says that, then he lays his hands on her, right? And then as soon as he lays his hands on her, she goes, whoop! And then she starts to worship all over the place, and the crowds are going crazy, and the people in the synagogue are like, oh my goodness, what is this? This woman's been bent over for 18 years, and all of a sudden, here she is just doing her thing and worshiping. And then as this happens, right, the ruler of the synagogue is upset. And I want to remind you, this entire scene is one of the few in Scripture where Jesus is completely on the offensive. He does everything because he wants to, not because he's instigated to do so. No one's asking him a question. No one's touching him for power. No one's wanting to get healed. The woman is just perfectly fine over there in the corner, and he sees her, he spots her, he calls her. Remember we talked about last week. He does everything. He sees, he calls, he touches, right? And he frees, right? He does it all. And after all of this, the ruler of the synagogue, and he basically asks this question. He goes, why do you have to do work on the Sabbath? Because the Sabbath law prohibits this. Essentially, he's asking, why not wait till tomorrow, Jesus of Nazareth? Why today in my synagogue of all places? Now, one thing you must remember about this is that the argument is not petty or stupid or even selfish. The ruler was simply wanting to protect the rules and the traditions that keep the church. And if you go to church here, we understand some of these things. Your parents would not want you to show up to church in a bathing suit. We don't do things like that in a good Korean Presbyterian church, or any church maybe, except maybe if you go to church in like San Diego or something, right? Like, there are rules and traditions you keep to maintain some of the things that you think are important. And that's all he was doing. One thing the ruler was not doing was saying healing is bad. He's not against healing. He was, I think in the heart of hearts, if he had seen this happen the day after, he would have been like, dude, that is freaking amazing. 18 years, and all of a sudden she's no longer, like, how'd you do that? But because it happened on the Sabbath, he couldn't see what was happening because all he cared about was respecting tradition and keeping and maintaining the status quo. And oftentimes, there's not much wrong with that. And I think if we're really being honest, we can relate. Because aren't we like this? Don't we ask our parents, hey, why can't you just wait? Your mom will go to you, hey, go clean your room. 5 minutes. No, not 5 minutes. Now, why? Is the house burning down? Like, what's going on? Why do I got to clean it now? Why do I got to do this now? Go do your applications right now. Why? They're not due for 3 weeks. Why do I got to do it right now? Just do it because like, we always want to push. We have a timing. We have a sense. We have a thing. We have an understanding, right? Our sense of, actually, oftentimes, parents and you, let me just, a little hint of advice. We have some parents sitting in the room. One of the major disagreements between parents and kids, we have the parents back there are cracking up back there because they know it's true, is timing. Kids' timing, parents' timing, they don't coincide. So then you fight about basically the same nothing. You're just fighting about when you want to do things, right? Now, all the ruler of the synagogue is saying is, heal tomorrow. Do this tomorrow. Or as I phrase it, he literally says, would it kill you to wait another day? And I think Jesus would have responded, maybe. And I'll tell you why in a little bit, right? So then, after this, Jesus then gives his counter-argument to the ruler's argument, right? And I love arguments. And so he goes, then this. He says then, wait, hypocrites, don't you take your oxen, very important. That's like people's lives back then. It does everything for them. Don't you take your oxen and then untie them, lead them over to a drink of water, and then let them drink on the Sabbath? And people are like, yeah, of course, right? So, if you can release your oxen on the Sabbath, then shouldn't this daughter of Abraham, one very, very important Jew, right, who is bound, be released like the oxen? And then if Jesus was, Kobe Bryant or Kanye, he was Mamba out, and he would have dropped the mic and he would have just walked off, and everyone was like, oh, and everyone's humiliated because he's like, Now, if you really look at the argument, though, right? If you look at the argument, and if you really see it from the Sabbath ruler's saying, here's what he's doing, okay? The ruler is not, again, upset at the healing or the releasing. He's upset at the timing. Sabbath is all about keeping the rules and keeping traditions, doing what's always been done. And why? He has good reason. God says, and we looked at it a while ago during the Ten Commandments, keep the Sabbath day holy. 6 days you shall labor or do work, and on the seventh, rest. For God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. God says it's very important for us to rest and not work on the Sabbath. And so the people back in the day wanting to maintain this holy law that God had given them, they just said, you know what, on the Sabbath day, you're not doing any type of work. And then because we're humans and we like to bend the rules and we like to find different ways and loopholes because that's what we do, right? Then they started creating all these subset rules to make sure that no one could find loopholes. But of course, because we're human, they started finding loopholes for that. So then they started making up all these other rules to make sure that people wouldn't do work on the Sabbath because you didn't want to disobey the Ten Commandments of all things, right? And so the Sabbath, right, was making sure that you didn't bend the rules or go outside the boundaries. It was very rigid, very strict, and it's very restricting in all things. And of course, because they wanted to make sure everyone followed the rules, as your parents might say to you, they say no exceptions, no buts, no ifs, just period. Follow the rules. Okay? Now, that's the way the ruler is seeing all of this. He's seeing it in terms of a set of rules. And students, if we're being honest, sometimes that's the way we feel like our parents see things. They just see the rules. They don't see the situation, maybe, right? And vice versa. Actually, newsflash, your parents think the same thing of you. You're only thinking about this and not the whole, right? But that's kind of the timing issue. So here's how Jesus sees the Sabbath. So his counter-argument is, hey, don't you untie your oxen and, on the Sabbath and lead it to water? And of course, the answer is that, yes, we do. Now, let me get into the specifics of the practice. What they did was because the law was that you couldn't untie your oxen. That was doing work. They had crazy laws, like if you walked a certain distance, you were doing work, right? And so the Jews, because they're very smart, right, they got around these things. So then the way that what Jesus was attacking was this little practice that they had created, right? Because untying your oxen and leading them to water was working on the Sabbath. So what they did by getting around it was saying, hey, and this is they said, if I untie my oxen with one hand, lead my oxen with one hand, and then lead my cow to the stream of river at the end of my land, and I don't have to cross over into another, then I have not yet done work. And that's what they did. So they created like literally every loophole they could find to make sure they could do this, right? Now, you have to ask, why would the Jews go to such lengths to make sure not to break the law, but yet to do what they wanted to do, which is to untie their oxen and give them water? Why? It's simple. And you probably figured out by now. No water equals what for the oxen? Most likely death. Most likely. Or if it's not death, super sickness from dehydration, and then eventual death, right? And like I said, oxen are very important, right, things, and so they didn't want them to die, right? And so, of course, they're going to do this for the woman. And so then Jesus' argument is then, if you're going to do that for your oxen, then shouldn't you do this for the woman, for the daughter of Abraham who's been tied up? And as you're looking at it, what some theologians have done, interestingly, is they looked at it and they go, wait, but if you really break down the argument, oxen without water on a hot Sabbath day will die, but they'll say Jesus' argument is actually not very good because this woman wasn't going to die that day if you didn't free her. So the ruler of the synagogue had a point. Just wait till tomorrow. She'll be all right. She'll still be bent over. Like, she's not going to keel over and die. She'll be bent over, but not keeled over and die. Like, she'll be okay if you just wait for tomorrow. But here's where things get really interesting, at least for me. I think Jesus is trying to say a few things about what's going on. And as she's trying to attack the Jews in multiple spots, and here's what he's doing. First, I love his language. He says, you untie your oxen. In Luke 14, there's another story about healing on the Sabbath, and Jesus heals a man with dropsy, right? And then he asks, is it lawful? And then he asks a very similar question. He said, which of you, having a son which belongs to you, or an oxen that belongs to you, if that son would fall into a well, wouldn't rescue him immediately? And of course, everyone's like, of course. Why? Because it's my oxen. It's my son. And so he's saying the only reason why you're not upset or you're not rejoicing with me is because this woman is not your woman. The Jews go through all the trouble to do what they do for their oxen. Why? Because it's their oxen. And if their oxen dies, guess who hurts? Me. So they're protecting themselves. And what he's attacking is the fact that they do not see this woman as one of their own. But to Jesus, she is a daughter of Abraham. And you don't find that phrase a whole lot in the scripture, but here you find it because Jesus is trying to make it explicitly clear that one thing he's attacking is the fact that they do not see this woman as one of their own, and that's why they don't care about why she's bound up or not. He's asking, is this daughter not one of us? Is this daughter not one of yours? Because if she was, you wouldn't have a problem with what I just did. And of course, the answer is clearly not, right? She's saying, this is my daughter. She's mine. She's my beloved. Of course, she has to be released. She's been bound for 18 years. Just as you rescue your own and release your own, I will always rescue and release and free what is mine. And all of you are mine. It's a lack of community. It's a lack of family. It's a lack of valuing what is most important to us, and that is God's people. And is valuing rules and traditions over all things. It's a selfish way to look at Sabbath. It's keeping rules that benefit you and me alone, and not looking at the whole of who everyone else is. This is the main reason why I ask you. I don't care if you play on your phones for yourself. Do it. But if you do it and it's bothering someone else to you, I have a problem. Why? You're not loving the one next to you and allowing them to worship. If you want to ruin your own life, I can't stop you. I would love for you to not to. But if you're ruining someone else's, then I have a problem, because that shows a deep selfishness and a lack of care for those around you. And Jesus is saying, if it is yours, you take care of it. Are we here for ourselves? A couple weeks ago, we looked at John 13, that we must love one another. The way we love one another in here will show everyone else out there that Jesus is indeed the King. Now, here's the second thing. Remember, the ruler of the synagogue is literally arguing. This is Pete Chung translation. Not the best, but I think it's pretty cool. He's literally saying, would it kill you to wait one more day, Jesus, to do what you just did? Now, I use that phrase purposely because I think Jesus would say, yes. Because see, oxen without water equals grave sickness and most likely death. And what Jesus is saying is a daughter or a son, one of us, without true, released, free Sabbath worship equals sickness and likely death. See, you might show up here and do the things you normally do. But if we are not first released to worship and worship the way we were intended and created to worship, soon and eventually, after however long it takes you, you will be rotting on the inside, and this will do no good for you. She's saying, I have to untie her, because this Sabbath is literally a matter of life and death. Authentic Sabbath worship is the quickest way to regain livelihood, joy, goodness, kindness, patience, gentleness, all the things Jesus talks about. And a lack of that in here is the quickest way, in my opinion, to impending sickness and likely death. Jesus is saying that without proper Sabbath worship, Sabbath rest, keeping it holy, and freedom in this place to worship that we were meant to worship, celebrate that we were meant to celebrate, all those things will likely and most prominently equal sickness and death. That without release and without freedom, we are rotting from the inside. It's the whole fig tree thing. You remember? When he sees a fig tree and he curses it all of a sudden? And if you remember from that sermon, the idea was the fig tree looked like it was good on the outside. It had leaves, but it had no fruit. It didn't have those little nodes. And what that tells you is that fig tree is rotting from the inside. So he says, if it's rotting from the inside, get rid of it. There's no good for it. We must have worship. Now, you might be asking me and saying, Pastor, that sounds really harsh. But let's get back to what the Sabbath is really for, right? Again, with the oxen, what they had done was they created every loophole they could find in the law because they wanted to get around it, right? They wanted to get around it to do these things and not have to do work. They're being very, very, very sneaky. But what this sneaky attitude tells Jesus about how they see the Sabbath is that they're saying, I'll keep the rules, I'll go to church so I can feel good, I can do what is right, I can make sure that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, but they miss the intent and the purpose of this place. Remember, chips are meant to be eaten in one sitting because that's when it's freshest. Clearly, Chung and Joseph understand this, and I think we need to understand this a little better. So what is the intent of this Sabbath? The intent of this day and this worship, particularly this entire day, is to stop whatever we are doing and to enjoy Yahweh and God and one another in worship that is undistracted and full. It is to find your identity not in your work, not in your schoolwork, not in anything you do during the week, not in all that you've served, not in your rule keeping, not in anything, but finding your identity as something bound and founded in your relationship with Yahweh and one another. That's what this is for. And if you remember back to the Ten Commandments series, and this was something that was life-changing for me, that if you look at the way God creates the world, and a theologian seems to suggest, right, and I can get you the quotes if you want to, he seems to suggest that God reserved a part of himself on the Sabbath day to give to us only when we keep and make sure this day is holy, which is to say that if we are not keeping Sabbath holy, if we are not using this place and making Sabbath day a worshipful place, then you are missing out on a chunk of God's life and God's personhood and his love that you will not get ever except for on the Sabbath, which means that if we're not worshiping in here and doing Sabbath the way God intended it, you will not have the fullness of life that God wants you to have, which then explains why we have impending death, if not for true Sabbath worship. It's setting aside a day in which you can enjoy God and enjoy one another in a radical, undistracted, holy, and set apart way. And if this is indeed the case, then Jesus is saying, do you honestly think that this daughter of mine, bound by Satan for 18 years, is actually able to enjoy me, worship me, find me in an undistracted, set apart, and radical way when she's like this forever? No way, never, ever, not possible. I have to release her. And if you have a problem with that, then you're not seeing things straight. I love Jesus, in part because he goes right for the gusto. So Jesus is saying, so you ask, would it kill you, Jesus, to wait another day? Yes, because this daughter is dying. Can't you see? And you're upset with me giving life to a precious and treasured daughter of mine? It cannot wait another day. Sabbath is about life. It's about freedom. It's about being complete and whole and undivided in relationship with God. And Jesus is saying, this woman is not. She must be set free first. That's why he calls them hypocrites, you actors. Remember that word, upokrites in Greek, means actor? One who acts on stage one way and behind it is another. Jesus is basically saying, how could you object to me giving life to a dying daughter of mine by releasing her from the bound of Satan? What better day than this day do this. No. A day meant for life is a day meant for freedom. And so if we understand Sabbath for what it really is, if we see it how Jesus sees it, then we would understand that this daughter, us, that if we're not enjoying Sabbath worship, we would find somehow every loophole in the book to make sure we can. Because it is of utmost importance to us. So here's what we learn, friends. One is a word of caution. This place is not about compliance. It's not about what good Christians do. It's why I set up a little while ago the whole cell phone in the back, put it over there. That's why I don't really care if you do or don't. It's about the heart with which you do. If you know me long enough, you'll realize that I don't really necessarily care what you do. I care way more about why you do it. Because it's the heart. It's what we're after. It's why I don't ever really come down on you very hard for the things that you do and or don't do. But when I identify a heart in you that's really nasty, I will come at it and I will attack it with a vengeance because I know that's where it starts. This place is about worship, not compliance. It's about life, not about rule keeping. It's about community, about freedom. It's about intimate, undivided relationship with Christ and one another. It's about fixing our gaze upon God, having our vision set on God and His people. Now you might understand why we do all the things that we do here in Sabbath. It's because when your gaze are focused on something else, your gaze isn't focused on God. That's the reason why I say things about you doing your homework in this place. It's not because I don't think homework is important. But when your eyes are on that, guess what your eyes are not on? It's not on God. When your eyes are on your phone, guess what your eyes are not on? It's not on God and on His people. That's why I say do whatever you got to do to make this an undistracted, undivided place where you can worship with all of your heart. And so if we think this place is about compliance and rule keeping, then it will always be stale. And over time, it'll be a drag. And God and His people will never, ever be yours, and you'll never care. And if we have somehow replaced Sabbath with compliance, rule keeping, being good, or serving even, then you've greatly misplaced the heart. This is real talk. No matter how much you serve our church, no matter how much you do VBS or do all these things, no matter how much you give, if without the heart of Sabbath and communion with God, let me tell you, you and I do not have God. Because if we did, this place would be one that overflows in worship. And then we go and serve with every fiber of our being because we know it's important. Second thing we learn is that the Sabbath is the key to life. In my opinion, the two primary reasons that most Christians do not live authentic Christian lives is because one, we don't know who we are. We don't know our bent-overness. We don't know the things that hold us back. We don't know ourselves. And we haven't taken time to learn our hurts, learn our pains, what makes us tick and what it is, who we are, what makes us go after what we are. That's why the whole Joyful Sisterhood, name pending, right? That's why we're doing these things. Why? So that you can learn yourself in the context of community and you can be released. And the second reason, right, is that we do not keep Sabbath, that we are missing out on a very essential and necessary part of who God is. So the life that He wants to give to us, He's kept only for Sabbath, and therefore missing a part. And so again, I might sound harsh, but if you're bringing your work in here, if you're bringing your schoolwork and all the things, if you're fixated on everything but this place and what you got to do for tomorrow, then you are going to miss out on the communion with God and His people. You're always going to miss. We're always going to miss. And let me tell you, I know it's hard to give up on stuff. I know it's hard not to bring your work here. I know it's hard not to focus on the Monday when you're in school, but my encouragement to you is to try it. I did. In the busiest season of my life, at least up to that point when I was 26. Mason was just born, had a full-time job. I was doing full-time graduate school work, and had 3 speaking engagements lined up, and it was Christmas season. And the Sabbath thing hit me like a ton of bricks from one of my professors, and I decided, as a crazy man, to to take Wednesday from 12:30 to Thursday 12:30 and not touch a single thing. No church work, no school work, nothing. Just me, Christina, and Mason. That semester, my overall percentage in my classes as a grad student was 98.9. Not because I'm smart, because I was focused and God gave life. Because you get something from Sabbath. It's not easy, but can we? And my encouragement to you is, at least in the beginning, try to set apart these few hours. Just a few hours. You can take the morning and the night, because God, again, understands our heart. If you can't give all of the Sunday as a Sabbath to Him and His people, then give a few hours that you're here, and He will understand your heart. He knows what you're after, and He will move it. It's always more than exact compliance. It's about the heart with which we do this. And the last thing that I think we learn from this, and perhaps most, is that without being released for Sabbath, to worship, keeping and seeing Sabbath as God intended, we are all dying, gravely sick, and we will not have life. Because then all of this will become an undivided thing, will become a divided thing. And this is not to pour guilt, and praise Him, you can come up as we get ready. But this is a time for you to be honest, because that's what I think is best for us. See, I think when we come into this place and we can't worship, or we can't pray, it's not because you're bad people. It's not because your faith sucks. It's not because you didn't pray enough during the week. It's not because you didn't read your Bible enough during the week. It's not because you didn't listen to your parents enough in the week. It's because our minds and our gaze is fragmented and all over the place. Which is why even as we go into a time of praying for things like this, when we prayed earlier for Christina, I'm assuming that there were a few of you in here who probably couldn't pray, were distracted, and couldn't get your heart straight. And you actually probably looking at me like, how can I not pray for the situation? This person is crazy. Like, who am I that I can't even pray? It's not because you're bad. It's because your gaze and your hearts are already divided once you enter. It's bent over. So the idea is that we need for God to release us to make this place about worship, so that you can have life the rest of the week. Because life is hard enough as it is, right? School is hard enough as it is. And if you're not getting the life God wants to give to you in this place, it's really hard to make it through. But if you're getting the life that you're supposed to get from this place, from God, that He reserves for us on Sabbath, then the rest of your week will look so drastically different, I promise you. So are we seeing Sabbath for what it is? The way that Jesus sees Sabbath, a day of freedom, a day where you can let loose and just worship. Let loose and celebrate. Let loose and maybe not talk about school because it doesn't matter, not today. Because what matters in this place is our God who insanely loves us and one another, whom He has given to us so that we can insanely love each other back. And I wonder how life would be different if that's the approach we take. I wonder how life would be different if that's the way that we see our families on Sunday. We don't worry about anything and just see them for who they are and just enjoy the crap out of each other. Because that's what God, I think, and I believe, desires for us here in this place. For it to set off a week, to recalibrate, to reground, to refocus, and most important, replenish the source of life that is in Him and Him alone. But friends, I know school is over, and maybe this comes at a not so good time because you don't have school the next day. But even then, would you take this place Say, God, I need you. You're always with me, I know. So help me to worship you with all that I have. To have the life that you so desire to give to us. And if from last week you're still not freed, then every week we come in here saying, God, free us to worship. So I encourage you to do so. Take your bent overness to Jesus and say, free me. And ask him, give me eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart that knows what this place is for and who you are. And I hope and I pray that it will give you life abundant, a life unlike any other. And that we would then be a community that shows the world who our God is. Let us pray and then go into worship. Father, I thank you that you will not wait another day, because life is everything to you. Because you want us to have life in every moment of every day. And it all starts here, it seems to think that you seem to be telling us. So help us to come to this place, to treat this Sabbath worship, to be freed and to be released from the chains, released from the bondage, released from the hurt, and to enjoy this day as a day in which you give life unlike any other, set apart, holy. And I pray over all of my friends, all of your beloved sons and daughters, that indeed you would call out to them, son and daughter, and they would respond to you. They would make that walk to you, and you would release them, and you would free them, and there would be a joy and a worship and a sound and a heart that comes from this place that no one has ever heard before. That we would blow the roof off this place, not because we need to, but because our hearts can't contain it anymore. So to you be the glory, God, because you are unlike anyone else. And we give you thanks that we are your people, freed to worship, freed to live, never bound by the works of the evil one or our sin, always freed by your grace, by your cross, by your empty grave, forever and ever. Amen. Take the moment and then we're going to finish with worship.